of course, in the middle of Job, and we've been on Job for several months now, though if you've been listening or been here for the lessons, you know that a lot of that time that we've spent here wasn't actually in Job. We spent several weeks talking about the devil and talking about some things, jumping off from Job, dealing with some of the things with the devil that we need to know about. And then also we, of course, went through a long series dealing with, why evil and pain and suffering exist, and what that means as far as in relation to God. The atheists claim that because of those things existing, that there can be no God of the Bible. So we went through a pretty thorough study of why those things exist and how that relates to us. So now then we got into, we're dealing with the first series of speeches, and we're probably going to only go either this week and maybe next week. We'll see how we do if we finish up. I told Jimmy to be on alert because I figured at the end of the first cycle is a good time for me to take a break for a little while here coming up on my busy season. And so Jimmy's going to take back over the Sunday morning class for a few weeks. So that'll either be, depending on how far we get today, either this week or next week or the week after, depending on how we wrap up this first series of speeches. But as we have discussed, Job's friends come and talk to him, not talk to him, they come and sit with him for a week after all these bad things have happened to him, and then Job says something, and he kind of gives I don't know what you would call it, a complaint or a brief of what his position is, and then his friends feel like they need to respond, so they start responding, and we've talked about how we use that to talk about a little bit about how sometimes it's good to just sit and be quiet for someone, or and to be careful about how what we say or what we're doing whenever we're trying to talk to somebody who's in a painful situation or hurting. So we've gone through Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar and the first time that they speak and say something to Job, and we're in the middle of Job's response to Zophar. We talked about in chapter 12 last week. We talked about where Job was at, and if you remember, we used an example from one of the commentaries that I was reading about how sometimes it feels like you can never do anything right. It was the story of the old man that was traveling with his young grandson, and he was riding his donkey, and when they passed through a country village, the onlookers grumbled, "Look at that old man walking while that young boy," or excuse me, look at that old, when they passed, his young grandson was riding a donkey, sorry, I got that mixed up. Look at that old man walking while the strong young boy is capable of walking. The criticism cut deeply into the heart of the grandfather, so he changed positions and started riding the donkey while the boy walked. But within minutes, other people started grumbling, "Look at that, a healthy man riding the donkey and making that poor little boy walk." So the old man changed positions again. This time he and the boy both rode on the donkey, but the critics howled, "Look at those heavy brutes making that poor donkey suffer." So the old man and his grandson jumped down and started walking. "No one will criticize us for this," the old man thought to himself. But he underestimated the critical nature of people. Soon he heard the people say, "Would you look at that, a perfectly good donkey not being used." So to stop all the criticism, the old man carried the donkey and the boy. The point of the story, of course, being that you can't make everybody happy. There's always going to be critics. And we kind of talked about it from two different perspectives. One, how do you respond to people when they're critical of you? And two, we need to be wary of how we're critical of others. And it's always easy to be very hypocritical. We see that in our society a great deal, that people are accusing others of doing what they themselves are doing all the time. Like we just see that all over the place. So that's kind of where we were at, and we're going to talk a little bit more about criticism and how to respond to that today, and some other things. Yeah, it was really echoing. You want it up higher now? All right. Well, apparently they weren't hearing me, but hopefully I'm not going to echo too badly now. All right, so we're going to read Job chapter 13. And then we'll discuss what Job is saying here.
Lo, mine eye hath seen all this. 13. Lo, mine eye hath seen all this. Mine ear hath heard and understood it. What ye know, the same do I know also. I am not inferior unto you. Surely I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to reason with God. But ye are forgers of lies. Ye are all physicians of no value. Oh, that ye would altogether hold your peace, and it should be your wisdom. Hear now my reasoning, and hearken to the pleadings of my lips. Will ye speak wickedly for God, and talk deceitfully for him? Will ye accept his person? Will ye contend for God? Is it good that he should search you out? Or as one man mocketh another, do ye so mock him? He will surely reprove you, if ye do secretly accept persons. Shall not his excellency make you afraid, and his dread fall upon you? Your remembrances are like unto ashes, your bodies to bodies of clay. Hold your peace, let me alone that I may speak, and let come on me what will. Wherefore do I take my flesh in my teeth and put my life in mine hand? Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. But I will maintain mine own ways before him. He also shall be my salvation, for an hypocrite shall not come before him. Hear diligently my speech and my declaration with your ears. Behold now, I have ordered my cause. I know that I shall be justified. Who is he that will plead with me? For now if I hold my tongue, I shall give up the ghost. Only do not two things unto me. Then will I not hide myself from thee. Withdraw thine hand far from me, and let not thy dread make me afraid. Then call thou, and I will answer. Or let me speak, and answer thou me. How many are mine iniquities and sins? Make me to know my transgression and my sin. Wherefore hidest thou thy face, and holdest me for thine enemy? Wilt thou break a leaf driven to and fro? And wilt thou pursue the dry stubble? For thou writest bitter things against me, and makest me to possess the iniquities of my youth. Thou puttest my feet also in the stocks, and lookest narrowly unto all my paths. Thou settest a print upon the heels of my feet. And he, as a rotten thing, consumeth, as a garment that is moth-eaten.
All right, so in chapter 13, Job continues his response to Zophar, and he once again says that his wisdom is not inferior to their wisdom. He says that they smear him with lies, and that they're worthless doctors. They can't diagnose and treat his ailments because they don't know what they're talking about, basically. He notes that it would have been wiser for them to have remained silent as they had the week they had been there, and pleads for them to really listen to him. And then he goes through a series of questions that challenges their competency to offer counsel, as though they were speaking for God. In verse 7, he says, will you speak what is unjust and deceitful for God? And I think something that we need to be aware of here, it's very serious to claim that we speak for God. I think we've seen that a lot in churches, where churches divide over things that people are unwilling to talk about because they both think that they're right, of course. So we need to be aware and careful. It's serious to misrepresent God with wickedness by incorrectly attributing to him actions that are not his. And when might we see that? What's an example of where you might see somebody incorrectly attributing actions to God, or maybe it's more like incorrect, what we would do to other people, incorrect motives or things like that? Or have you ever seen anybody do that? Yeah, whenever something doesn't go our way, right? Yep, exactly. I think I mentioned, like, whenever I was younger, it used to be like, well, if I had a bad day playing baseball, it was like, why did God do that to me? And just like, God didn't do that to me. That's just the way it is. So yeah, anytime things don't go our way, we might have a tendency to blame God incorrectly. That's a great example. Anybody think of anything else? Of course, in this situation, they're blaming God in that they're saying he's punishing something that he's not punishing. Like, it's an incorrect thinking of the whole entire situation. God isn't punishing Job for a sin he committed, and that's the way that they're looking at it. Going further than that, he's saying in verse 8, will you show partiality for God? Where he says, will you contend for him, for God? Does God need us to contend for him? Depends on the way you look at that question, I guess. He doesn't really need us, of course. He's God. Does he use us would be a more accurate question. Does he use us to contend for him? Sometimes. Sometimes he uses an unlikely source. If you remember, there were times where God raised up nations to punish Israel, and you wouldn't, those nations weren't righteous. You wouldn't expect that to happen. So God can contend for himself using whatever means he decides to. But they viewed themselves as God's attorneys. Job's wanting to go to court for God, so they're basically arguing the case for God. And Job wants them to remain neutral instead of contending for what they think is God's side of the argument. And they were so arrogant in thinking that God had appointed them to do this, that the way they're coming across is this is the way it is. If you remember what Eliphaz said in his speech, here's the conclusion of the matter. We've discussed it, and that's the end of it. We've come to the right conclusion. So they were convinced that God was using them to teach Job a lesson. Here again, do you know anyone else who acts as if they speak for God and there can't be any argument with them? Do we ever do that? Something to think about. It's easy to see the hypocrisy in others and not as easy to see it in ourselves sometimes, right? Does that mean, every time I mention this, does that mean that we shouldn't contend for what we think is right in the scriptures, according to what God says? That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that we need to be very careful about how we go about saying things and how we talk to people, and making sure that we actually do know what we're talking about when we're saying things, and not just hearsay or things that we're not certain about. They obviously didn't have all the facts, and had come to the wrong conclusion, and so it's possible for us to do that in some instances as well. So we need to be aware of that. Then he says in verse 9, will it be well when he examines you? This goes back to the hypocrisy thing, right? Okay, so you're saying that I'm being punished because of the things that I've done. How well do you think you would do if God were to examine your lives? Of course, Job knew that they would be exposed just like anyone else would. And then verse 9, he continues, will you deceive him as one deceives a man? Do you think you can pretend that you're perfect and that God doesn't know what you've done? So Job says that God would rebuke them, and that turns out to be correct, as we see later on toward the end of the book. And then he says, will you not be terrified of God, in verse 11? So even though they were prideful and criticizing Job, when their time came, he's saying, would you not experience dread and being in the crosshairs? And he concludes by saying that their arguments should be burned up and that their defenses are like clay. Remember that Job was probably still sitting on the ash heap at this point in the city dump as he speaks to them. And he's kind of telling them something similar to what we talked about last time, that they should be considering in our last lesson, where he talked about consider what what you're saying before you start criticizing, or what your problems are before you start criticizing someone else. All right, so just kind of to recap dealing with criticism, what are some things that we can learn here from Job's questions to his friends? What are some things that we might be able to pick out in our own lives? Some that we just went through, or something else that you thought of as we were going through it? Did I already put everybody to sleep? Maybe.
Everybody's in deep thought.
All right, so like we said, consider the whole situation before we start to criticize someone. And when I say criticize, of course, I don't think we should ever attack somebody inappropriately. When I'm talking about criticizing, argue, there again, arguing might not be the right term. I'm thinking of it from a debate standpoint or whatever, where you start talking to somebody about a problem that you see or making your point or those kind of things. Before you start to accuse somebody of doing wrong, make sure you have all the facts. Because a lot of times, I think a lot of our problems come from attaching bad motives to people whenever we don't know what people are thinking. And so that can cause problems. And as I said, we can't always judge things based on their appearance. In this case, did it appear to Job's friends that he was in the wrong for something? That's what they thought, but that was not the case. Once again, be careful not to make assumptions and do not manipulate facts in order to prove our own view of things. Arrogance is a problem. Don't make sure we're not arrogant and think that we have all, that we know it all. And then, of course, remember that we've all fallen short at times. We've all done something or said something that we shouldn't have. And so that should temper the way that we speak to others when we're trying to make a correction or something along those lines. All right, and then in verses 13 through 19, Job, as we've talked about, Job switches. So now he's not responding as much to his friends as he is talking to God. He switches over, and he says he wants to present his case before God in court, and he says that he's willing to accept the consequences of his words. He asks if it makes sense that he would risk his life claiming innocent if he wasn't. In verse 15, Job says that even if God would kill him, he would still trust in him. I saw some in the commentaries, there's, I guess, the American Standard Version, whenever it came out, translated this differently, and it said something like, I have no hope. Like it said, even if he kills me, and then he says, I have no hope. And most of the commentaries I read said that translation, I guess maybe that's a more literal translation, but it doesn't seem to make sense with what Job's saying there. That, because in the very next verse, let's see, it's in the very next passages, here, okay. So 15 says, though he slay me, and this is the New American Standard, though he slay me, I will hope in him. Nevertheless, I will argue my ways before him. This also will be my salvation, for a godless man may not come before his presence. So verse 16 doesn't make sense as much with 15 if you say, I have no hope. Because then in 16 it says, this also will be my salvation. So so I think I like the New American Standard and the King James translations better, as far as them saying, even though he slay me, I will hope in him. But like I said, the American Standard actually kind of says, I have no hope. I've lost hope. Either way, when you read the passage, I think Job is waffling between hopelessness and hope. But I don't know if he's actually saying, if he's saying that he's lost all hope at that point and then turning right back around and saying, but I have hope, or which way he's going there. But I like the way it reads better, at least with the New American Standard, where it says, I will hope in him. So that's a little bit of a tough translation there as to what's being said there. But he still believes that God will vindicate him even if he's killed. And then, like I said, in verse 16, he expands on his thinking, and he believes that an appearance before God would turn out for his deliverance because he knows a godless man can't come before God. So even though he's doesn't have a complete view, he's still demonstrating a proper understanding. We can't come before God with sin. Like, God can't stand sin, so we can't come before God with sin. And he knew that to plead his case before God was an indication that he would be innocent of what his friends were accusing him of. So he asked his friends to listen to him for a third time in verse 17, and he feels like they still hadn't heard him at this point, which is another thing that we had talked about. When we're talking to someone, rather than sitting there thinking about how we're going to respond, it might be a good idea to actually listen to what they're saying first and hear them out, rather than just preparing our attacks to launch at them, like what Job's friends were doing here. So at this point, it seems that Job is definitely despairing, and he turns to God in prayer. So beginning in verse 20, he offers a prayer to God, and he says, he pleads to God to stop afflicting and terrifying him, and to remove his hand from him and not overpower him, so that he can present his case before him. Those were his two conditions. Like, just, I know I can't do it if you don't allow me to, so please allow me to do it. He then asks what he could have done that was so wrong. I think you can see some desperation here as he becomes more reckless and confident as he talks to God. He asks why God hides his face and why he is treating Job like an enemy. Once again, it would appear that God had communicated with Job directly at times from some of the things being said here. So at this point, God's silence is probably confusing him as to why would God not say anything about what's going on here. He felt like he was helpless and worthless before God and being blown around like a leaf in the wind. And that's where he says in verse 25, wilt thou cause a driven leaf to tremble, or wilt thou pursue the dry chaff? So he's perplexed about why God is even noticing him, at this point. Job seems to believe that maybe God is punishing him for something he did when he was young. Verse 26, for thou dost write bitter things against me, and dost make me to inherit the iniquities of my youth. We see other passages talking about in our youth things that we might do, like in Ecclesiastes. It talks about young, what we do when we're young. Also, some in Psalms. So here he's saying maybe I did something when I was young that I'm now being punished for much later. He feels like a prisoner under maximum security, and through his many pains, he has learned that he is slowly decaying to nothing. So once again, though Job is not referring to spiritual things the way that we do today, he expresses spiritual truths and things that we can learn from. Without God, what are we? What is a person without God? In the end, we're nothing. We just waste away to nothing, right? I mean, nothing's going to stand. That's what it talks about a lot. We know that things throughout history, empires come and get destroyed, buildings are built and then destroyed. Everything's going to decay. Nothing's going to stay forever, but except for with God. But at this point, like I said, Job is losing hope, and what kind of things can cause us to lose hope for the future?
I was just going to say real quick, well, this country, it was founded on, those principles.
Right.
We still supposedly say the Pledge of Allegiance that has under God in it. Some people don't, but what would this nation be?
If we hadn't been established the way we were, you mean?
Yeah, under God. Yeah.
Well, I guess we would still be a colony of England, right?
I guess.
without that. But yeah, it would be very different. It would be very different than what it is now.
Yeah.
Of course, there's other things other than just the founding on Christianity, on Christian principles that makes it different than any other country ever. Right. But at the same time, going back to, I think I've heard the United States be compared to Rome, the Roman Empire oftentimes, and how, what happened to Rome. Do we see things like that happening here today in our country? I think we do. We see a lot of things that happened in Rome starting to happen here. But it just follows the cycle of, countries rise in power and then they fall for various reasons, whatever those reasons may be. But But certainly, I think this country has been blessed because of the way it was founded and the things that we've been fortunate enough to have. With that being said, go back to my question that I was just asking as you said that, what can cause us to lose hope for the future? What kind of things can happen to us? What's that? Apathy? On whose part? On our part?
Yeah, just
And what can cause apathy?
laziness, lack of commitment.
Okay, lack of commitment.
See that a lot. Jimmy's talked for, months about the numbers in the church dwindling. It's just,
So yeah, seeing less people being committed to God, or a lack of commitment on our part. In general, why was Job starting to lose hope? What was happening with him? What didn't he have hope for?
Everything.
For a better future, right? I mean, like everything had just fallen apart. So when we start to lose hope for the future, whenever things just blow up on us, in any number of ways, that can be, if you remember the Great Depression, whenever people lost a lot of money in the stock market, what happened at that point? A lot of suicides, right? People lost hope. Now, was that hope in spiritual things, or was that hope in material things? That was material things. That's something, when we put too much focus on the material things here, I think that can lead to a loss to that, can cause problems. We have to keep that eternal perspective in order to remember that we have hope ultimately after death, no matter what happens here, I think is key. What can erode our hope in God?
I think it's important too to remember with Job, we say he lost everything. It wasn't just that he lost everything. He continued to get worse. So when you think you're down at the bottom, you haven't seen anything yet.
That's a good point. Yeah, we've heard the statement like, well, it can't get any worse, or tomorrow will be better, or those kind of things. Well, what if it's not? What if every day keeps getting worse?
Yeah, that's the case of Job. Literally, he'll say his health is way, what health? But even that's getting worse.
Right.
And then he's got his friends to help him.
So when we look ahead and all you see is more misery and pain versus any hope for a brighter future, that actually you were probably answering my next question. What can erode our hope in God when we just see things getting worse? When we don't.
Now, see, that gets back to the statement we made months ago. Even Job in his, and I'm reading out his stuff, he's deeply depressed. He's not just a little depressed.
Right.
Even at that moment, because of who Job is, and while he feels that he's being, dare I say, persecuted by God, he still comes back and says, but him I'll trust him.
Right. Exactly. Well, yeah, even right here, we're seeing that. Yeah.
So, to say what causes us to lose faith in God, I think that had more to do with where our foundation was to begin with, not
Yep.
events.
Yeah, you're right. It's back to what we had talked about before with that. What kind of things can cause us to lose hope in God? Well, seeing children suffer, the death of a loved one, seeing injustice, things that we feel God shouldn't allow to happen. Those kind of things can cause us to lose. If we don't have things, if things aren't right, if we're not in the right relationship, if we don't have the right character, I think is what we were talking about at that point, can cause us to falter. how strong of a relationship do we have with God? How much do we really believe in eternity? How much focus do we place on living the life that God wants us to here with an eye towards the hereafter? I think I always use Paul as an example, because to me, he's like, his letters just talk about it, like where he talks about, it would be better for me to go on, but I'm going to stay here, at least for the moment, for you. Paul's total viewpoint was on eternity, and you see that in his writings. And I think the reason that is because Paul had a special glimpse into that. He says he was taken up. And so he had a special view of what that was, and so we can rely on what he's saying kind of to understand where we should think. And it's not that it's as easy for us. We didn't get that special view.
But in Paul's case, before that episode, he's left for dead, and he still gets up. And I'm sorry, I'm amazed by that passage.
Mm-hmm.
He walks back into town. You realize, I've never been to a stoning, and I've never seen people stoned and left for dead. But to get up and then walk back into town, he's got to be hurt.
Oh, yeah. Well, if he was left for dead, that means that they thought they had killed him, so he clearly has some serious problems, yeah.
What's going on. But he still trusts in God before he's seen anything, and I think that gets back to that foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, before meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus,
That's what I was going to say, yeah.
was zealous for God.
He was wrong, but he was always committed. No matter, he was wrong in what he was doing. He was persecuting Christians, but Paul was always committed to God, what his view of God was, which goes back to why it's so important that we do have the right view of God. Paul was killing Christians. He thought he was right. And so we need, when we're trying to help others, or when we're thinking about our lives as Christians, we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And you can only do that by studying God's Word. I mean, that's the only way that you can know what God wants us to do and can have confidence in that. And even then, there's problems. As I said, we see churches split, we see arguments, because people have different interpretations of it. And sometimes those arguments are worthless. Like, we don't even need to worry about them. Sometimes they are important, and we need to make sure we're on the right side of those doctrinal issues. But we can only do that by proper study of God's Word and looking at it. So that's an important thing. Along with that, when we feel like we're losing hope, what's something we can do, or what are things that we can do or think? A lot of times it's an attitude. Like, what can we think to help us keep our hope strong? What can do that? Where do we turn? To God? It goes back to character. Do we have enough in our relationship with God? Is it what it needs to be? Church family. There again, it's all of these things are kind of qualified in that you have to say, well, not everything, but a lot of them are qualified in that, what do we say about people? People can fail us and can be wrong, as Job's friends were here, right? But having a good support mechanism can help us through some tough times. And certainly the church family is an important part of that. So I think I agree with your statement, but with just the qualification of knowing that sometimes we get it wrong. And so being aware that we can't wholly count on other people in every instance. I mean, like, for instance, what happened with Job's wife? She didn't end up being a good support system in that case. But yeah, she was there, right? and we've already talked about that. Like, there's no indication that she wasn't there to whenever the benefits came back in later. But yeah, she at that point in time, at that one point in time, she was not helpful to Job. in that circumstance. So that can happen. You know, the people we rely on can fail us at times, but in general, as a general rule, yes, a good support system, being able to rely on others can help with that when we're having trouble. Anything else anybody can think of? All right, well, timing is bad here because we're ready to go into 14, but we only got a couple minutes. So rather than trying to play chapter 14 and going into that, we'll do that next week. So Jimmy, you get one more week. I did have a couple of, in Wayne Jackson's book on Job, there are some questions here, and I'll go after just a couple real quick here as we get ready to end. Maybe is our clock slow back there? Or are we?
We're 10:42 right now.
40, okay, we're good. Okay, so we got a couple minutes here. We'll just go through a couple of these. He just asked a couple of questions that I thought, just kind of as a review for what we talked about here in this first section. He says, according to Eliphaz, what was the traditional position of his day regarding the suffering of the innocent and the upright? You guys remember what's the basic argument here? What are his friends saying?
Good people don't have problems.
Yeah, God rewards good people, and evil people are punished. Of course, we know that that's not the case, but that was what their argument was. And what's the purpose of Eliphaz? Why did he say that? Why was he emphasizing that kind of a situation to Job? Well, because they're saying, Job, you had to have done something wrong, right? You can't be innocent. You know, that, what about, actually, I don't want to ask that one because we're going to talk about this one next time. And does Job feel that God is just? When you read what he's saying, do you think that Job feels that God is just?
Now that's a trick question.
And that's the one we're going to end on, too.
The answer is yes and no.
Yes and no, yep. So in what ways does God feel that does Job feel that God's just?
He's counting on him for his salvation and his vindication. So he looks and he says, hey, God, you're doing this to me, and I don't know why, but I'm trusting in you anyways. So he's looking for God's ultimate justice. At the same time, he's claiming God's unjust for what he's doing to him.
Yep. So he's going back and forth. He's like, I'm in this horrible position, and it's not right. I don't know why this is happening. Why is God doing this to me? But then at the same time, he's saying, but God is my hope and my salvation. So yeah, he's kind of going back and forth. And I think that's the debate you're seeing as you go through here is Job debating with himself, really, of not with his friends. I mean, he responds to his friends, but you see a lot of Job debating with himself as to why is this happening to me?
That's not an uncommon thing for people to do.
Right.
And it's not unhealthy.
Yeah, as long as we have the right attitude when we're asking the questions, those kind of questions aren't necessarily bad.
Yeah, we should be checking
Yeah.
ourselves.
Right. All right. Well, we'll end there for the week, and like I said, next week we'll finish up the first cycle of speeches here with Job in chapter 14, and then after that, Jimmy will be taking over for a few weeks. I don't know exactly how long. We'll switch it up here, but and then we'll return to Job and keep going on it for who knows how long next year sometime, hopefully. So we'll be back in 15 minutes for worship.